Today we will learn and reflect on Plutarch's life of Lysander, also consulting Thucydides and Xenophon. You cannot understand the Platonic dialogues without first understanding the history of the Peloponnesian War, because so many of the leading figures of this period are referenced in the Platonic dialogues. Lysander was appointed as the Spartan naval commander near the end of the war. He was both an effective military leader and an able diplomat, negotiating Persian assistance from Cyrus the Younger in building and funding the fleet of triremes that would check Alcibiades and the Athenian generals who had succeeded him, eventually winning the Peloponnesian Wars for Sparta. At the end of our talk, we will discuss the sources we used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted as SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. And before we get into the lecture, we want to have an update of the Peloponnesian Wars up to this date. The Peloponnesian Wars followed the Greco-Persian Wars by about 50 years, as Thucydides describes it, the Pentecontatia. And we reflected on the period between the Greco-Persian Wars and the life and career of the Athenian statesman Pericles up through his death by the plague in the second year of the Archidamian War, which was the first phase of the Peloponnesian Wars. After the war, hawk generals of both Athens and Sparta were killed in battle. Nicias negotiated the Peace of Nicias, which, although it was not very peaceful, it did end direct hostilities between Athens and Sparta for nearly 7 years. But the Peace of Nicias was broken when Alcibiades agitated for Athens to send out a large portion of its triremes, plus thousands of hoplites, into the doomed Sicilian expedition. The talented general Alcibiades was indicted on trumped-up charges and went into exile in Sparta when his conviction appeared certain. When the Syracusans defeated the dilatory and timid Nicias, the Athenians lost everything. Triremes, hoplites, rowers, even the generals, including Nicias, were destroyed and slain. Few escaped. And Sparta restarted the war in response to the Athenian aggression and her loss in Sicily. Alcibiades was exiled from Sparta after he slept with the king's wife, and she gave birth to their son, and he fled to the court of the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, who was allied to Sparta. He advised Tissaphernes that he should not decisively support either Athens or Sparta, but keep them evenly matched so they could wear each other out, so Persia could then swoop in and take over. And the Persians under Tissaphernes brought the Ionian Greek city-states, particularly those on the coast of Asia Minor, back under Persian control. Now, Alcibiades maneuvered to be reappointed as general of the Athenian forces, and likely would have won the war for Athens if the Athenian assembly had not been so hypercritical and so judgmental about his efforts and his mistakes, which all generals make. Now, we'll cut a general video on Sparta in the near future. This video on Lysander will cover the final phase and final defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian Wars that lasted over 2 decades and over 2 generations of combatants. And now let's look at the life of Lysander as a youth, or what we know about it. Plutarch says only this about his early years. Lysander was brought up in poverty, and like a good Spartan, he had a manly spirit, superior to all pleasures. And like all good Spartans, he felt pain at disgrace, and exalted when commended, and these qualities enhanced his virtue. Ambition and the passion for distinction were embedded in his character by his Laconian education. Lysander was submissive to great men beyond what seems to be agreeable to the Spartan temper, and could easily bear the haughtiness of those who were in power. Lysander endured poverty, and he was not at all enslaved or corrupted by wealth, yet he filled his country with riches and the love of riches. Although he imported an abundance of gold and silver after the Athenian War, he did not keep 1 drachma himself. And these historical sources reveal little about the youth of Lysander, which perhaps reflects the Spartan custom of placing youths in military training camps beginning at a very young age, like 8. And now we'll talk about the selection of Lysander as the Spartan commander. And Plutarch describes when Lysander was pressed into service. After the disaster in Sicily, Athens was no longer the master of the sea and was challenged everywhere. But Alcibiades, returning from banishment, took the command and produced a great change, again making the Athenians a match for their opponents by sea, and the Lacedaemonians, greatly alarmed, with fresh courage and zeal, seeking an able commander with powerful armaments, selected Lysander as the admiral of the seas. The king of Persia sent his younger son, Cyrus the Younger, to administer the Ionian provinces and to assist the Spartans in their war efforts. Now, Professor Kenneth Harrell of the Teaching Company comments that Lysander and Cyrus had an excellent working relationship, that Cyrus respected the competency of Lysander and saw in Lysander a Spartan leader who could win battles when fighting the Athenians. Xenophon reports, Lysander went inland to visit Cyrus and took with him the ambassadors from Sparta. They lost no time in telling Cyrus how badly, in their opinion, Tissaphernes had behaved towards them, and they begged him to take a really serious and energetic part in the war. That, said Cyrus, is exactly what my father the king has asked me to do, and that is what I mean to do myself. I shall do all that I can. He told them that he had brought 500 talents with him, and that was a massive sum. And if that was not enough, he would use his own money, and if that also ran out, he would break up his throne of silver and gold on which he sat. Cyrus asked him what he wanted in the conflict, and Lysander said, Since you are so very kind, I earnestly request that you add 1 penny to the seaman's pay. Now, a penny was a large amount in that day. So instead of 3 pence, they might now receive 4 pence, which meant that their pay would exceed that of the Athenian rowers for the first time in the war, tempting some mercenary rowers to switch sides for a pay raise. And Thucydides writes, the Spartans often proved to be remarkably helpful enemies for the Athenians. For Athens, particularly as a naval power, was enormously helped by the very great difference in the national characters. The Athenian speed versus the Spartan slowness, and Athenian enterprise versus the Spartan lack of initiative. And Xenophon likewise notes that Lysander was not an aggressive commander. Although Lysander had distracted and weakened his enemies, he was afraid to engage by sea, Alcibiades being an energetic commander, having a superior number of ships, and unconquered in both land and sea. Now, this caution did not mean Lysander was a timid commander like Nicias, but it did mean that he understood the strengths of the Athenian fleet and his fleet's weaknesses. So Lysander was cautious. Alcibiades was a brilliant commander, so Lysander often avoided open combat with him, waiting for his enemy to make a mistake. Now, in this respect, Lysander can be compared to the later General Fabius in the Second Punic War, who faced the brilliant Carthaginian General Hannibal after he wiped out 2 Roman armies through brilliant battlefield tactics after he marched his war elephants over the Alps with his army. And this Roman General Fabius, his surname was Cunctator or Delayer, and he was one of the first generals to employ guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles that he could lose against Hannibal. But he was constantly dogging and ambushing the forces of the enemy, wearing them down since their supply longs were so long. And he too waited for the enemy to make a mistake that he could capitalize on, and his chance would soon come. Now, the Athenian expectations for Alcibiades, since he was such a skilled general, were so high that they would not tolerate any mistakes, and unfortunately he made a mistake. Alcibiades left the fleet in Samos to attend to a military matter in the Hellespont, and he left his helmsman Antiochus in charge of the fleet, with strict instructions not to engage the enemy in his absence. This was a mistake that Lysander took advantage of, luring Antiochus into a naval engagement. And in this engagement, the Spartan fleet was orderly, while the Athenian fleet was disorganized. And so, although the Athenians did not suffer high casualties, they did lose 15 triremes, damaging the perfect reputation of Alcibiades, who then went into exile in his castle near the Hellespont. Will Durant has an excellent retelling of the history following the exile of Alcibiades. Desperate, the Athenians ordered that the gold and silver in the statues on the Acropolis should be melted down to build a new flotilla of 150 triremes, and offered freedom to those slaves and citizenship to those allies who would fight for the city. The new armada defeated a Spartan fleet near Lesbos, and Athens once again thrilled with the news of the victory. The Athenians, experiencing easy victories, thought all victories are easy, and even after Alcibiades was gone, asked too much of their generals. There was a hard-fought naval battle with the Spartans, and although this was a great Athenian victory, some far-off Athenian ships were wrecked, and her crews were clinging precariously to the wreckage some distance away from the main fleet. Now, a portion of the fleet pursued the fleeing Spartan ships. In the meantime, a fierce storm hit the ships who were assigned to rescue the wrecked Athenian rowers, so they were unable to sail. Not only did these rowers clinging to the wreckage drown in the rough seas, their bodies were swept away by the storm and could not be recovered. Due to the importance of the Greeks' place on burying the dead so they would not eternally wander the face of the earth, charges were brought against the generals for this perceived act of impiety. And Xenophon devotes an entire chapter to the debate and trial of the generals in his history. The trial itself was illegal, even under lax judicial procedures of the time, as the assembly voted on their fate, not a jury. Xenophon writes, each of the generals spoke in his defense. Their speeches were short, since they were not allowed to speak for the length of time permitted by law. And it was pointed out that what prevented the recovery of the bodies of the veterans was the violence of the storm. The generals were not tried separately. The Athenian assembly took one vote on whether to execute all of them, and the injustice extended to their families as their property was confiscated. Socrates famously protested that these procedures were illegal, as the trials were not heard by a jury. And this is an excerpt from the speech defending the generals in Xenophon's history. Why this excessive haste? What are you frightened of? Is it that, if you act legally, you will not be able to condemn or absolve anyone you like, whereas you can do so if you act illegally by one vote by the assembly? Yes, but suppose you put to death an innocent man. Just remember how painful it is and how useless indeed to regret what one has done, and how much more so when one's mistake has cost a man his life. And indeed, quite soon afterwards, the Athenians regretted what they had done and voted that complaints be lodged against those who had deceived the people, talking them into the execution. But this remorse could not resurrect the dead generals. So the Athenians then appointed less experienced generals to replace them. And Plutarch likes to comment on the moral qualities for the Greek lives he comments on. Plutarch criticized Lysander for abusing his office. Lysander promoted those who were his friends to honors and offices, and to gratify their covetousness was their partner in injustice and wickedness. So much so that all flocked to him and courted and desired him, hoping if he remained in power that their highest wishes would be gratified. Plutarch also complains how Lysander had a great indifference to the obligations of an oath. His recommendation, according to this account, was to cheat boys with dice and men with oaths, which is not very honorable to a lawful commander, not in line with the Laconian character. Now, we don't know where Plutarch got this from, or what the criticism really means. He was writing over 4 centuries later, and his sources were prejudiced, as are all sources. And the sources for Spartans were somewhat sparse anyway. Which is why his lives of Lysander and other Spartans have fewer personal observations than his lives of Athenians. Now, perhaps Plutarch is suggesting Lysander is not your typical Spartan commander, because he valued the war over keeping his oaths. Plutarch retells how Alcibiades tried to warn the Athenians of their impending doom if they were not more careful of their position. At great personal risk, Alcibiades came in horseback from his castle nearby to the Athenian army, and found fault with their captains. First, that they had dangerously pitched their camp on an exposed and open beach, a very bad landing for the ships. And secondly, they were far from their supplies at Sestos. Whereas if they simply sailed to Sestos, their supplies would be close, and the anchorage would both be safer and further from the enemy. But the commanders were disdainful. They would not listen, so Alcibiades, who even suspected treachery, departed. Plutarch continues, Conon, one of the Athenian commanders, was the first who saw the Spartan fleet advancing, and shouted out to embark in great distress. But his diligence came to naught, because the men were scattered about. Some went to market, some walked about the country, or went to sleep in their tents, or got their dinners ready, as their commanders were oblivious of the danger. As the enemy advanced with shouting, Conon with 8 ships sailed out, making his escape, and went to Cyprus. Plutarch continues, the Peloponnesians, falling upon the rest, took many ships, destroying others. While many men returned to their ships unarmed and scattered, they died at their ships or were slain where they fled. Lysander took 3,000 prisoners along with generals, except those few who fled with Conon. Taking the Athenian ships in tow, having plundered their tents, with pipe and songs of victory, Lysander sailed back to Lampsacus, having accomplished a great work with small pains, having finished in 1 hour a protracted war lasting decades. Some looked upon the results as a divine intervention from the gods, and as an aside, it was common practice in ancient warfare to execute those whom you captured as prisoners of war. And here for the practical reason, like, what's Lysander going to do with 3,000 prisoners, and how's he going to feed them? And this victory was even more complete than the American victory over the Japanese in the Battle of Midway in World War II, where the tide of war turned when, in a fateful 5 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were fatally bombed by American dive bombers, and a 4th carrier was fatally dive bombed a few hours later. Plutarch tells us that after this victory, Lysander, sailing about to the various cities, bade all Athenians he met to return to Athens, declaring he would spare none, but kill every man whom he found out of the city, intending to cause immediate famine and scarcity in Athens, so they would not make the Spartan siege laborious. And Plutarch continues, when suppressing the popular governments and all other constitutions, he left a Lacedaemonian chief officer in every city, plus another 10 rulers. He sailed leisurely about, establishing his supremacy over the whole of Greece. Neither did he choose rulers by birth or wealth, but appointed as rulers his own friends and partisans, doing everything to please them, and putting absolute power of reward and punishment into their hands. And Lysander participated in bloodshed and massacres, helping his friends to expel their opponents, which did not set a good example of Lacedaemonian government. Plutarch continues, Lysander united his forces in Attica with the 2 Spartan kings Agis and Pausanias, hoping to take the city without delay. But when the Athenians defended themselves, he with his fleet passed again to Asia, destroying the forms of government in all the other cities, placing more of them under the rule of 10 rulers, killing many, exiling many. And in Samos he expelled the entire population. In his history of the war, Xenophon mentions Melos and the Athenian massacre of the Melians when he tells of the terror the Athenians felt when news first came that their fleet had been destroyed, and that Athens was now defenseless from the fleet commanded by the Spartan navarch Lysander. Xenophon tells us the worries of the Athenians. As news of the disaster was told, one man passed it on to another, and then a sound of wailing arose, first from the Piraeus, the port of Athens, and then all along the long walls until it reached the city. That night no one slept. They mourned for the lost, but more still for their own fate. They thought that they themselves would now be dealt with as they had dealt with others, with the Melians, colonists of Sparta, after they had besieged and conquered Melos. Then he lists several other atrocities the Athenians now regretted committing. When Lysander knew the Athenians were suffering from famine, he sailed to the Piraeus and reduced the city, which was compelled to surrender unconditionally. Lysander wrote to the ephors in charge in Sparta, Athens is taken, and the magistrate supposedly wrote back, taking is enough. Now this Laconian response was a wishful memory. Plutarch says that the more complete instruction was to pull down the Piraeus and the long walls, and to the Athenians, quit all the towns and keep to your own land, and if you do those things, you shall have peace if you wish it, and also restore your exiles. And he's referring to the Athenians who had taken up residence in all of the cities of their allies. Now, in a congress of the Spartan allies, some states proposed that the Athenians should be sold as slaves, and a Theban said that they should pull down the city and turn the country into sheep pasture. But afterwards, in a meeting of the and I want to point out that really is a common occurrence in ancient warfare, that once you defeat a hostile city, you slay all the men and enslave the women and children. But afterwards, in a meeting of the captains, they melted with compassion, as it seemed to be a cruel deed to destroy and pull down a city which had been so famous and produced such men as helped fend off the Persians in the Greco-Persian Wars some generations back. And Xenophon continues, the Spartans offered to make the peace on the following terms. Of course, the long walls must be destroyed. All ships except 12 would be surrendered. All the exiles were called to Athens from the allied cities. Athens shall have the same enemies and friends as Sparta, and follow Spartan leadership in any expedition Sparta may make, either by land or by sea. Now Plutarch says that Lysander sent for flute women, and pulled down the walls and burnt the ships to the sound of the flute, the allies being crowned with garlands and making merry together, counting from that day the beginning of their liberty. And Plutarch also says, Lysander altered the government, placing 30 rulers over Athens, known as the 30 tyrants, and 10 rulers in the Piraeus. And he stationed a garrison in the Acropolis and appointed the Spartan Callippus as governor. Now we're at the end. Let's reflect on the effect that Peloponnesian Wars had on ancient Greece. Now, in the annual battles before the Peloponnesian Wars, the Greeks preferred to battle in hoplite formation, eyeball to eyeball, shield wall to shield wall in front of their cities. Pericles innovated with the new tactics. Although the Athenian hoplites were more than capable of facing their Spartan counterparts, Pericles refused to battle the Spartans in Attica, but rather sought to destroy the economic base of Sparta and her allies, using her superior navy to interdict trade and raid coastal areas. But this led to such hatred between the populations that these larger wars were nearly impossible to stop. Perhaps Pericles unwittingly doomed Greece to 6 decades of destructive war by this change of tactics. Not only were the economies of all Greek city-states devastated, but also the demographic bases of these economies were decimated. Historians don't often discuss the effects of these massive casualties that easily dwarf the American casualties of the Civil War, and probably even the Russian and German casualties of World War II. We can estimate the casualties best for Athens. In addition to the casualties of decades of heavy fighting, we can estimate that maybe a quarter of the armies were wiped out in the plague. Perhaps another quarter in the doomed Sicilian expedition. Perhaps another quarter were slaughtered when Lysander captured the Athenian fleet due to their carelessness. Plus many more were executed by the 30 tyrants in the next year after the war. And the total casualty rate must have exceeded 50%, maybe as high as 60 or 70% of the Athenian hoplites and rowers. And civilian casualties were also high. Now, after the war, Athens must have been a city mostly populated by widows and orphans. After the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta initially led the effort to liberate the Ionian Greek colonies from Persian rule. But the Spartan general Pausanias caused resentment for his harsh treatment of these allies, leading them to ask Athens to form the Delian League that evolved into the oppressive Athenian Empire. But now, at the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, the Spartan Lysander was far harsher than even Pausanias, tolerating corruption and murderous terror from the aristocrats the Spartans had placed in power when the radical democracies were dismantled. This led to the Athenians overthrowing the 30 tyrants when Lysander was away in Egypt and reestablishing the radical democracy, and this was tolerated by the Spartan king Agis, who was tiring of the harsh policies of Lysander. And the proclamation that Thucydides credits to the Athenian guest friends who addressed the Spartan assembly at the beginning of the war when they were initially debating on whether to declare war was very prophetic. And this is what the Athenians told the Spartans. On one point we are quite certain. If you were to destroy us and take over our empire, you would soon lose all goodwill which you have gained because of others being afraid of us. And these perpetual large-scale wars did not end with the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. Peace once again simmers for about a decade, but then the Corinthian War and then the Boeotian Wars erupt. The account of these wars dominates Xenophon's Hellenica, History of My Times. The Peloponnesian Wars are only the first couple of chapters. Though perhaps not as destructive as the Peloponnesian Wars, these large-scale wars are waged for another 3 decades. Sparta is eventually defeated by Thebes, who frees her Mycenaean Helots slave populations. These perpetual wars left all Greek city-states in a weakened state, vulnerable to takeover by the expansionist Macedonia under King Philip and his famous son, Alexander the Great, in a later generation. Now, what happened to Lysander after the Peloponnesian Wars? After the war ended, Lysander sent the public money with the gifts and crowns for many who sought the favor of a man with such great power, with his associate Gylippus. But Gylippus, he was a Spartan that led the opposition in the Sicilian expedition. But Gylippus is caught skimming out of the sacks of coins. His servant revealed in a riddle to the officials that under the tile of his house lay many owls, and this refers to the Athenian owls, who are the most common coin of Greece. Gylippus went into exile in disgrace, and Plutarch notes that the wisest of the Spartans, dreading the influence of money, which had corrupted the greatest citizens, objected to Lysander's conduct and declared that all the silver and gold should be sent away as mere alien mischiefs. Here Plutarch makes a general observation that moral habits induced by public practices are far quicker in making their way into men's private lives than the failings and faults of individuals are in infecting the city at large. And Plutarch also observes that Lysander, having greater power than any Greek before, showed a pride and superiority greater than even his power warranted. And Plutarch judges Lysander harshly. This ambitious temper of Lysander was indeed only burdensome to aristocrats, but through having so many people devoted to serve him, his character became a mix of contentiousness and ambition. he observed no sort of moderation either in rewarding or in punishing. His friends and guests held absolute power over the cities, and the only thing that would satisfy his wrath was the destruction of his enemy. Banishment would not suffice. Plutarch comments that the slaughter of those in the popular party in the towns of the Athenian allies exceeded all expectations, as he did not kill only for offenses against himself, but allowed his friends who were the local rulers to execute whomever they chose to satisfy their many hatreds and cupidity. What offended many was a certain licentiousness and wanton self-will. Lysander's power was feared and hated because of his unmerciful disposition. Now, Lysander visited the Temple of Ammon in Egypt, kind of like the travels of Solon, and Plutarch notes that on his return, Lysander regained the reputation of a person who employed his command not in gratification of others, not for applause, but strictly for the good of Sparta. However, he was resentful that the kings checked his power. He was no longer the commander of all the Greek city-states, and Plutarch mentions he was scheming to lead a revolt against the leaders of Sparta at the time of his death. Lysander died on the battlefield soon thereafter, fighting the Thebes in Boeotia. The Spartans were grieved by his death, and Plutarch reports that upon his death, the discovery of his poverty proved his merit, since this was a poverty not tempted by so much wealth and power from the homage of the cities and of the Persian kingdom. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Our primary sources for this video are Plutarch's Life of Lysander and the histories by Thucydides and Xenophon. And I am going to again complain about the Dryden translation of Plutarch. Often I am drastically tinkering and condensing the verbiage to make the English as quotable as was the original Greek. Although Thucydides lived through the war, his account drops off in mid-paragraph and mid-sentence soon after the oligarchic coup, after Alcibiades was recalled as general. And Xenophon literally begins his history with the words, after those events. Xenophon was known in antiquity as an historian, a general, and a philosopher, and that is, a moral philosopher in the Stoic mold. Xenophon was highly regarded by both ancient and medieval scholars, and with Plato and St. Augustine, he is part of a unique club of prolific ancient authors whose writings have mostly survived, where no major works are lost, which means that copyists were very diligent in preserving their writings. But Xenophon is deprecated by many modern scholars. The attitude of the British lecturer Bury, whose lectures we have reviewed in prior videos, is very typical. J.B. Bury states that there were 3 historians writing immediately after Thucydides, and he dismissively says that of these 3, the only name that is familiar is Xenophon, who is probably the least meritorious of the 3. And I would demur with that judgment, but anyway. In history as in philosophy, Xenophon was a dilettante. He was as far from understanding the methods of Thucydides as he was apprehending the ideas of Socrates. And we'll discuss both of these criticisms. J.B. Bury does condescend to compliment Xenophon somewhat. He was a happy literary talent, and his wide-ranging writings, taken together, reveal him as an interesting figure in Greek literature. But his mind was essentially mediocre, incapable of penetrating beneath the surface of things. Now, J.B. Bury thinks he's deprecating Xenophon, but he's accidentally complimentary. If Xenophon had lived in modern times, he would have been a high-class journalist and pamphleteer. He would have made his fortune as a war correspondent. So far as history is concerned, his true vocation was to write memoirs, such as the Anabasis, often translated as the Persian expedition. And the Anabasis was well known in the ancient world and the medieval world. And it is Xenophon's humble and often humorous true-life adventure story how the Greek mercenary army, the army of the 10,000, who elected Xenophon as general in the middle of their campaign, was trapped in the field in the middle of the Persian Empire after the main battle was fought. And in that battle, his client Cyrus the Younger was fighting to succeed his father as king. The Greek hoplites won the battle militarily, but this win was wasted when a spear ran through their patron Cyrus when he charged his brother in battle. The Greek forces successfully marched for months through hostile territory, battling both Persians and fierce mountain tribes to reach the Greek colonies on the shores of the Black Sea. Now, in my humble opinion, Professor Bury, our historian of historians, is guilty of what all historians are guilty of. That is, in his history, he's telling us more about himself than he is Xenophon. Professor Bury is more the dilettante than Xenophon, and if you consult the source, you'll discover I simplified his dilettantish choice of words chosen to show off his erudition. And what's wrong with being the Ernest Hemingway of antiquity? And we plan to cut a video on Xenophon's Anabasis in 2023, since it is a highly entertaining adventure story. Modern scholars lose sight of the fact that Plato was not Socrates' only student. His students also included the Cynic philosopher Antisthenes, and Zeno and the other Greek Stoics were inheritors of this Cynic tradition. Likewise, the Socrates of Xenophon can be seen as following more in the Stoic tradition of focusing on moral teaching. For example, St. Justin the Martyr quotes Xenophon's Stoic Socrates on ladies' virtue and vice. We also consulted Xenophon when studying the Platonic dialogues on the trial and execution of Socrates. And Xenophon also wrote his recollection of a dinner party like Plato's Symposium, which features Alcibiades. Now, there's no debating that Plato was a better writer than Xenophon, but Xenophon was also an excellent writer in his own right. And just because his classical Greek Stoic viewpoint sounds simpler than the mystical Platonic philosophy of the forms, and the unintelligible supreme one of the Neoplatonism, does not make his simpler moral teachings less relevant. And you can indeed argue the opposite, that they are indeed more relevant to learning how to live a godly life. And there's no doubt that Thucydides was a more accurate historian than was Xenophon, and you can tell that from the footnotes. Although many scholars suspect that the last book of Thucydides may have been a rough draft, since it has more than the usual number of inaccuracies. We consulted another Greek historian for this period that Professor Kenneth Harrell mentions, Diodorus Siculus, who lived in the 1st century BC in the period between Xenophon and Plutarch, but I didn't find any interesting additions for the broad narrative for this video, although I did find an interesting addition for the period of the 30 tyrants. We read in Thucydides that the talented Syracusan naval fleet that was assisting Sparta was recalled to battle Carthage, who was trying to conquer the island of Sicily. Diodorus Siculus tells us the story of how, over many years and many battles, the Greek and native cities of Sicily were able to counter the forces of mighty Carthage, just as the Greeks had repelled the Persians generations before. And the history of these battles between Syracuse and Carthage leads to the question, what was Alcibiades thinking when he talked the Athenians into embarking on the Sicilian expedition? What if they had defeated the Syracusans? Would they then have to battle the mighty empire of Carthage? Dr. Wikipedia thinks that Carthage did not include war elephants in her forces until later, when fighting the later Greek king Pyrrhus of Pyrrhic victory fame. But Egyptians were using war elephants at the time, so perhaps Carthage was also, because, after all, what is Carthage without her war elephants? And we want to turn you on to the works of Donald Kagan, although we did use him as a source. He's a frequently quoted source by Professor Harrell of the Teaching Company, and he also has a 4-volume history of the Peloponnesian Wars. So if you want to learn more about the Peloponnesian Wars and do more reading, Donald Hagen is an excellent place to start. Since all our videos on the Peloponnesian Wars use many of the same sources, we also have a video on book reviews of ancient Greek history. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.